worship is with biblical storytelling and dialogical sermons, where you are in conversation, we are together with the gospel so that we hear it. Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. So may God's Spirit open the ears of our hearts. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea, but such a very large crowd gathered around so that Jesus got into a boat and sat down in it there on the sea, and the whole crowd was gathered there on the shore beside the sea. And Jesus taught them many things in parables. In his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as the sower scattered seeds, some seed fell on rocky ground where it had not much soil, or some seed fell along the path, and the birds came down and devoured it. And some seed fell along on rocky ground where it had not much soil, and immediately it sprung up and began to grow because it had so little soil. And when the sun came out, it was scorched, and because it had no root, it withered away. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it out, and it yielded no grain. And some seed fell on good soil, where it brought forth grain. It grew and increased and yielded some 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And then Jesus said to them, if you have ears to hear, listen. Now just hold the gospel in your heart for a moment. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. And such a very large crowd gathered around so that Jesus got into a boat and sat down there in the boat on the sea. And the whole crowd gathered there on the shore beside the sea. And Jesus taught them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow. And as the sower scattered seed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came down and ate it up. And some seed fell on rocky soil, where it had not much soil to grow in. And immediately it sprung up because it had so little soil. And when the sun came out, it was scorched, and because it had so little root, it withered away. And some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it out, and it yielded no grain. But some seed fell on good soil, where it brought forth grain, and it grew and increased and yielded some 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And then Jesus said to them, if you have ears to hear, listen. So you've already been participating in the story. What do you hear? What do you notice in the story? Anyway, and Teresa will bring the mic around, or if you shout it out, I can repeat it so it can be heard. But anyway, this is for all of us together. What are you hearing? Yes. Rob.
So as a soil scientist, I find myself that I contain rocky soil, dry soil, and rich soil, and so in that parable for today, it just seems like God is always sowing seed, and there's always the opportunity that it's going to take root in my life if I respond to it, right?
Yeah. All of you heard something. Annette.
I hadn't heard it before, but then I thought, I'm rooting for the birds.
I hear let's keep sowing seeds, and we don't have control over how something's going to grow or respond, but doesn't stop us from sowing seeds of love or service.
Yes, a very important part of the story. What are you hearing in the story? Russ.
I could be a little confused because another teaching of his was don't throw pearls to the pigs, so why are we throwing seed on the rocky soil?
In the bigger story, we find lots of things that at least sound like they conflict. But in the story, okay, go, Rick. Yes.
No, you go ahead.
No, please. Yeah.
Well, when I've read this in the past, it's always seemed like Jesus is saying it's really important how open you are to the messages. And if you're open, then you're like the good soil. If you're not, you're like the rocky path or the other. And I think that's maybe the point I see anyways. He's trying to convey.
Okay. Where does the story begin? Where does this gospel begin? On the shore. Has anybody been in Palestine? I grew up on an Iowa farm. It's very different than in Palestine. There's lots of rich soil. It's very hilly and rocky. Very. It would be impossible to plant seed that wasn't somehow involving rocky ground and thorns and so on. Listen once more, and then you're going to help me with the story. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea, and such a large crowd gathered around that Jesus got into a boat and sat down in it on the sea. And the whole crowd was gathered there on the shore beside the sea. And Jesus taught them many things in parables. In his teaching, he said to them, listen, a sower went out to sow. And as the sower scattered seed, some fell along a path, and birds came down and devoured it. And some seed fell on rocky ground, where it had not much soil, and immediately it began to grow because it had so little soil. And when the sun came out, it was scorched. And because it had no root, it withered away. And some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it out, and it yielded no grain. And some seed fell on good soil, where it brought forth grain. It grew and increased and yielded some 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. Then Jesus said to them, if you have ears to hear, listen. So we've heard it 3 times. I'm going to ask you to do with me what I call a communal telling. There are no wrong responses here. Let's tell that story, that gospel, from the beginning. Where does it begin? Do you remember? Anyone? On the shore. And what is Jesus, what's happening on the shore? The crowds are gathering, and he gets in a boat, and what? Sits down. And then what? Yes. So, yes. What, Ernie? He tells parables. This is part of in Mark's gospel. In chapter 4, Mark begins, as I've said before, is very vivid and graphic and fast-paced. And in this section, right at the beginning of ministry, Jesus is telling lots of stories. So this is a series of parables that you would begin to unpack. So he's telling parables. Then what happens? He said, listen. Yes, very important. What frames the story? What's the first and the last word of the story? Yes. So he begins with listen and ends with, if you have ears to hear, listen. So now that sets up the story Jesus is choosing to tell. Now, none of us are farmers, and none of us live in Palestine, so it's sort of not our story, or it's a challenge for us to imagine it. But so when Jesus begins the parable, where does it begin? What's Jesus start talking? A sower went out to sow. And? Yes. Where? Yes. And what happens? Exactly. So that's one piece of the story. That's one part of what Jesus is telling. What comes next? What is it? Rocky ground. And? It emerges fast, but no roots. No, exactly. Yes. So see how quickly you get the story? If we were doing this, if I had an hour with you in a biblical storytelling workshop, you would all know it within an hour, that you could tell it. So then, okay, so it's a rocky ground, and then what next? Thorns. And what? And chokes it out. Yes. And then what? Good soil. Yes. And good yield. Yes. The story is that simple and complex, challenging. And then how does Jesus end? We already said, but say it again. Because, yes. We could go on with this a long time. But I'm going to tell you two stories of this story in my life. I'm going to end with that. In the mid-'80s, when I began pastoring at Cincinnati Mennonite Fellowship, nearby was a person I didn't know when I moved to Cincinnati. It was called there, named Tom Boomershine. Tom is now a long retired New Testament prof who imagined recovering the oral tradition of biblical stories. We could talk about this a long time. They were all told, these stories were told long before they were written down. The whole biblical tradition came to us out of an oral being O-R-A-L, spoken, and A-U-R-A-L, hearing, because it takes tellers and hearers for there to be a story. And Tom had gathered a few people together in Dayton, Ohio, which is 50 miles up the road from Cincinnati, in the summer of June of 1986. And I went to join them. I had found out about it and went to join them this was a very fledgling group of about this many people. And as we worked with stories and told stories, a lot of things happened for me then that changed my pastoral and preaching life. But one particular thing in that is Tom shared with us at one point, imagining, saying, look, if the gospel and Jesus and the biblical stories are that important to us, what if we went somewhere else in the world and shared stories, our stories, Jesus' stories, and so on, that to a place that are presumed to be our enemy? So what if some of us went to then, this is 1986, to the Soviet Union? When Tom shared that, I knew that was my mission. And so we talked about it, and 2 months later, in August of 1986, Tom and I met in a McDonald's in Dayton, Ohio, and imagined taking a group of biblical storytellers to the Soviet Union in August of 1988, which was the millennial anniversary of the first baptism in Russia. So it was different groups were going to help celebrate the 1000th anniversary of Christianity in that region of the world. And it took us 2 years. I organized and coordinated a group of biblical storytellers. We learned this exact story in Russian as well as English, and took it and told. I could tell you a multitude of stories out of that, but I only want to tell you one. So we were at a Baptist church, which is where Mennonites were affiliated. This was not a Mennonite group. I was the only Mennonite, except we had 3 youth. Our 18-year-old daughter, Tamara, went along with that between her junior and senior year of high school, and 2 other 18-year-olds went with us. When we were in Moscow at the Baptist church, telling the story and having conversation with people, I met a young man there who was about my age. I think he was a little bit younger than I am. And I discovered his name was Sergei. He was very, very quiet. He knew a little bit of English, and we had some other interpretation. And we got very connected and found out that he was a conscientious objector in Russia who had been sent to a psychiatric center because he refused to go to war. He had been there for 6 years, held in the psychiatric center, and now was released. We were going to Gorky Park to the fabulous Russian circus that evening, and so Sergei went with us. We had a couple of extra tickets. And when we came into Gorky Park, Sergei wasn't right with us. He was joining us at the circus there. We found a little booth to get food, but we couldn't read Russian and couldn't speak it very well. And you walked up to a register, and they had on the board there what you could order, and then places outside to sit down. And so we were in line, and I was the back of our group trying to buy food. And I saw this person behind me smiling in a Russian military uniform. So he was smiling, and he could speak English. He said, "I order for you." So he talked, and he ordered and came and ate with us, Sergeant Andre. And then as we talked and ate together, he went to the circus with us. At one point, as we went in and sat down in the circus, then another delegation member took a photo of us, because here was, waiting for the circus to start, a Mennonite pacifist pastor, and on one side was Sergei, a Russian CO who refused to go to war, and on this side was Sergeant Andre. We could never have created that story. It happened out of trying to live that story. The other one is, I'm a Benedictine Oblate, as you know, some of you do, and I'm returning to St. John's Abbey in 2 weeks before I come back here for our Mennonite Catholic bridge folk. Over the last almost 50 years, I have been to at least a dozen monasteries, Benedictine monasteries, and I've learned three things. First, well, I actually first learned about monasticism and the rule of Benedict from my seminary professor, Clarence Bauman, who is a Mennonite mystic par excellence. And so I was always intrigued by that. That led to my going to monasteries in different places. The rule of Benedict begins with a particular word. What is it? Listen. How? Listen with the ear of your heart. Our listening, we cannot listen to Jesus just hearing the words. We listen with the ear of our heart. So that's the first thing. Second, I learned, it took me some time, I'm a slow learner, to go into monasteries. I learned two very important things. First, that every Benedictine monastery for 1,500 years is grounded in the rule of Benedict and Jesus and the gospel. You know that as soon as you enter the doors, by the daily office, by all kinds of things. I can tell you many things about that. But second, I began to recognize every monastery lives that in a unique way. They have to live it out of a lived, faithful life in their time and place. That's happened for 1,500 years. If Mennonites truly listened that and drew on that way of the tradition, it would transform the church and the world. If Christians did, I think it would prevent most of the conflicts and divisions in the church. Learning how to live within a tradition of the gospel and, in their case, the rule of Benedict, but some sort of guiding, grounding ways, but always needing to do that faithfully within place and context of what does that mean? What does that look like? How does that shape who we are right now? And that's what Jesus is doing with the parable of the sower. Jesus is not telling us, stop wasting seed. Is not telling us, you all have to be good soil all of the time. Jesus doesn't do that. He tells stories that portray the reality of our lived, messy, conflicted, wonderful, gifted lives. And tells us how to listen with the ear of our heart. Listen, God is calling, which is the song. We will see. Thank you.
Seven, six, five. Listen